Hello everyone, and welcome back to this series where we are building a Shopify app together. The app we're building is a simple product updater, and in this one, which is part 2, we're going to set up our API routes on the server and start going through how to work with the REST and GraphQL APIs. If you've just stumbled on this video, make sure you watch my past couple of videos where we walk through setting up an app and going over the app structure. Today is going to be a lot of fun though, so let's pull up our project and jump into the code editor. Okay, so you're going to want to go into your main server file. In this case, it's index.js under the web folder. It may be different depending on the app template you're using, but if you've been following along with my videos, you should be able to follow exactly what I'm doing here. So in the server file, you'll want to come down to about line 110 or wherever this verify request middleware is being called. Any endpoints after this middleware needs an active and authenticated session. Let's first take a closer look at this verify request middleware and see what it's doing. As the comment says, any API endpoints placed after this line will require an active session. So if we want to hit this products count endpoint, it will first go through the verify request and then continue to the actual route we're hitting. Let's open up verify request and we can see what it's doing in order to make sure that an active session is available. The first thing it does is call this load current session method and passes in the request and response objects along with the flag that says whether we're using online tokens. So when a user goes through the Auth flow, then you're given a token that serves as proof that they've been authenticated and that you're allowed to make API calls with that token. If the token is invalid, then it'll throw an error and you won't be able to hit the Shopify API. Luckily, Shopify gives us connectors that we can use to plug in our database. Then they will handle the session storage for us. The template we're using comes with a SQLite database right here, and it's using the SQLite session storage connector made by Shopify. They have a bunch of different connectors. For example, I've used the Postgres connector in my most recent app, and they also allow you to create a custom one and define your own storage strategy if you want. But right out of the box, this is managing our sessions for us. You can take a look through the source code in this Node API repo to get a better understanding of how this load current session method works, but it basically is making sure that your request object has valid properties, the right auth headers, and it fetches a session that is saved in your database and returns it so you can use it to authenticate your API call. After loading in the session, this verify request middleware uses the session info and the request object to make sure that the shop info matches in both places. If not, it redirects the user back through the auth flow. Then it checks to make sure the session is active. Then we have some billing code here. It's basically just checking if we need to redirect to the billing page. In the else statement, it's actually running a small test query that just gets the shop name to make sure that the access token is still valid. If the query fails, they need to go back through the auth flow. If everything checks out, they are pushed through and able to move on to the intended API route. Let's go back to index.js and move down to check out the default endpoints they have here. We can see that they have the products count endpoint here, which uses the REST API to get the total number of products a store has. This one is pretty straightforward. There are actually a couple ways to query the REST API. This method is importing the product resource directly from the API package, but you can also create a REST client like it shows at the top of the documentation here. With the way they're using the REST API, if you want to, say, change this to get all of the orders count, then you can just import the order resource from the same place. Or if you want to work with product images, you can import the image resource. The documentation examples are all using this import resource method, so that will be the most straightforward way, even though at the top it shows it using the REST client. Once you have the resource imported, there are certain methods that you can call on that resource. You can refer to this REST API documentation to see examples of all those methods and figure out what you need from there. So if you want to create an order, you come here to order and go to the post option for creating a new order. You create a new order, pass in the session, add the properties for the order, then call order.save. So just scrolling through here, we can see that the order object has the save method, cancel method, close method, open method, and all the rest that you'll find as you search through this list. We'll move on down to the next endpoint here, which is the products create endpoint. You'll notice at the first line of this callback handler, And pretty much the first line of every endpoint callback handler is getting this session from load current session, like we saw in the verify request middleware. After we get the session, if you come down a few lines in that products create endpoint, then it's calling the products creator helper function, which is found in the helpers folder. Let's open that up and see what it's doing. The first thing it's doing is creating the GraphQL client so we can make requests with the GraphQL API. Then it's running this GraphQL mutation to create the new product count number of times. By default, this count is set to 5, so the code here is creating 5 new products. This right here is the structure of a GraphQL client request. And how this works is we have the query prop, which is the formatted GraphQL query. This one is pretty small. It just accepts a prop called input of type product input, and then it's returning the ID of the newly created product. If we come back down to the client request, we see the input prop being set here under variables, and this is all that the product is created with, a title and a price. They have these helper functions to get a random title and price, using these adjectives and nouns and making a random pair. Now that we know what's going on here, let's open the app and just show how this endpoint is being used now. So remember, to spin up the app, you have to just go to the directory in the terminal, the main directory of the project, and type in npm run dev. It may have you log into your Shopify account and answer a couple other questions, but at the end of it, it'll start up the app and give you a URL that you can use and just put in your browser to go directly to the app. On the home page of the app, they give you a button to populate products. We could go into the front end code and see exactly what this button is doing, but instead let's open the inspector tool on your browser. Then we'll go to the network tab and watch the call made when we click this button. We see that it hits the products create endpoint that we were just looking at, which then calls the GraphQL API to create 5 products in a loop. Now that we know how this works, let's modify it a bit to add a random product image in addition to the title and price. I've hosted some sample images that we can use here that I've put in a gist on my GitHub. The link will be in the description, so head over there and copy the array of images. Then let's go back to the product creator helper file and add a function to get a random image. We can pretty much copy exactly the function that's being used to get a random title here. Just remove this line since we don't need it. Switch out the adjectives variable for our images array. Then return the random image URL we selected. To see how to add an image to this product create GraphQL endpoint, let's take a look at the docs. We'll go to the GraphQL admin API reference docs, click on products and collections, and since we're modifying data by creating products, we'll click on mutations. We'll find the mutation to create a product, then look at what the input looks like. We can see there's an input prop here that's of type product input, and it actually shows all the fields just below it here. You could also click on the type here that will take you to a new page where you can view all the fields. Scrolling down, we see there's a field here called images, which is a list of this image input type. Click on that type and we'll see the fields we need in order to add an image. So it looks like in order to add an image, we can just add the images prop to the input object, and that images prop will be an array with these image objects in it. For the actual image object, we can just add a source prop for now that will populate with a random image URL as it's creating the products. Let's also see how to add a description real quick, so we can just populate that with some default text. And it looks like the field we need to use is this description HTML field. So we'll make note of that and add in some text there for each product as well. In the product creator file, we'll add in that images prop, then add the object and call random image to get a random image URL for the product and set that to the source prop. Then we'll add the description HTML field with some default text, and let's save that and go back to our store. We'll click the button again, and this time we expect the products to be created just like last time, but now we'll go into the products page of the admin, and the newest 5 products that we created should all have images and descriptions now. And there we go. Now that we've seen how we can create products with the GraphQL API, let's add an endpoint to fetch our products. Right now, the only fetching we're doing is to get the count of all products, but it doesn't give us any info about the products. And we'll need that info for our app, so let's go over how to fetch that. In index.js, let's just add a new endpoint above the products count route, and we'll call it just API/products. As I mentioned before, the first thing we'll do in any of the route handlers is get the session using load current session. We'll pass in the request, response, objects, and this use online tokens flag, which in our case will be false. We know we'll be returning the products array in the data, so let's just add in the last line here to send back the response with an empty products array for now. Okay, so to keep this server file clean, we'll create a new file under the helpers directory called fetchproducts.js. We can pull up the product create file to use as a reference, since we'll also be using the GraphQL client here to fetch the product data. Let's create the main function and call it fetchProducts. The first thing that we'll do in this function is create the GraphQL client, and we can do that through the Shopify helper object we pull in from the API package. So we'll import Shopify, then we can create this new GraphQL client by calling shopify.clients.graphql. And that takes 2 parameters, which is the session.shop and session.accessToken. And by the way, if you wanted to use the REST API here and create a REST client, you can do that by just calling shopify.clients.rest instead of GraphQL. Okay, and by using these 2 props from the session, it sets up everything we need to make calls with this client. Then we'll just want to make sure that we're passing in the session to this fetch products function. So with the product creator helper, we use this client.query to run this mutation to update those products or create the products. And in this file, in this fetch products function, we're going to create a query just like in the other one, except this is going to be not a mutation, but an actual query that will get the product's name and IDs for now to keep it simple. So whenever I'm working with the GraphQL API, I like to pull up the GraphiQL Explorer. This is a tool that lets you build, validate, and test queries and mutations in a nice editor so you don't have to wait for the mistakes to show up in your code. I'm not super familiar with GraphQL myself, since I've always used REST before building Shopify apps, so I have this open constantly and it saves me a ton of time. It has the documentation and types all over here to the side, so you can dig deeper into a specific field and figure out how you need to structure your query or mutation. So it's an extremely helpful tool. There's also a Shopify app that you can install on your store if you have specific data you want to work with. But for this tutorial, the default sample data they have here will work just fine. The default query they have here is just to get the shop name. So if we click the play button, we'll see the results of the query in the middle pane. If you click on the query root type under the root types section in the panel on the right, you'll see a list of all the different fields you can query on. If we search shop, we'll see that there is a field called shop, which is what we see over in the query panel. If we click on it, it tells us that it's of type shop. And if we click on that, then it will show all of the subfields under that shop field. These subfields are what we can return from the shop data. We know that there is a name subfield since it's in the query over here. So let's search for that right here. And there is the name field that is just of type string. I unfortunately can't do a whole overview of GraphQL right now, but that is a quick starter just so you can see how to find the fields you need to query. And we'll go over another more complex example now while we build out a query to get some basic product data. Let's go back to the top of this query root type that has all of the available fields, and let's just search product. We see about 7 or 8 results of fields that we can query, but the one we're interested in is products on the bottom, since we know we want to get data for multiple products in our store. When we click on that, we see it's of type product connection. So when you see a field that is a connection type, my understanding of it is that it's essentially a list of these field objects, in our case, a list of products. And because it's a list, these connections require some arguments so that we can make sure we're getting the data we want, kind of like a function. With any of these connection types in Shopify, you'll need to specify either the first or last argument, which will tell GraphQL how many of these objects we want to fetch. So if we go over to the query pane, let's remove this shop query and add in products. And since it's a connection type, we'll need to add these parentheses, almost like a function, like I mentioned. And then we add in let's add in the first argument. And the first argument is just a number type, and it specifies how many objects we're fetching. So let's put in first colon 10. And this is saying, give us the first 10 objects in the products list. And then again, just like a JavaScript function, we add in a set of curly braces. And this is where it can get a bit confusing if you're new to GraphQL, but the syntax within these connection types looks like this. The structure of the query response will return a list which is called edges, and within that list, the objects themselves are referred to as nodes. Within these nodes, again with curly braces, that's where you put the fields you want from the individual objects or nodes. So to visualize that a bit more, click on the product connection type, and you'll see that the edges field, which is a list of these product edge types, click on that product edge type, and you'll see the node field here, which is finally the type of the actual object we're trying to get. So if we click on product, we see all of the product fields that we can query. I've just put the ID field here, but if we wanted to get the date the product was created as well, we can add this created at field under the node. And now all of the product objects returned from this query will have the ID and created at properties populated. If we want to also get the description, just add the description field under the node as well. Once you get the hang of it, it's not that bad to work with, and it's fairly straightforward because you're specifying everything you want, and you're only going to get back what you want, which is a main selling point of GraphQL, among other things. So for our query, when we're writing in our app, we just want to get the ID and title of each product for now. So we'll leave the ID field there and just add in the title field as well. Let's hit the play button to make sure the query is formatted correctly, and it's working. Now that we know that this query is working exactly how we want it to, let's copy the whole thing, go back to our fetchProducts.js file, and add a variable to the top called fetchProductsQuery. Add a set of backticks and paste in the query you just copied. And there we go. We now have our query to get the first 10 products in our store. We'll come back down to this default function we were setting up, and we already have the client created. So now we can just call client.query, and that will take an object as an argument. That object will have a data property, which in turn will have a query property. And we can just assign that to our fetch products query we just added. And then let's just return the response we get from this query. We'll add in a try catch and format the response and everything when we start working with the data in an upcoming video. So for now, let's just make sure we're calling this function from our API products route. Go back to index.js and back to our products endpoint that we added, and assign our products variable to this new fetch products function. Don't forget to add the await, and then pass in the session object to the function. Now, when we hit this products route from our front end, it should query the first 10 products from our store, then return the response back to the front end. So let's test that it's working correctly now. Under the front end folder, go to components/productscard.jsx. And underneath this handle populate function, let's just add another function called fetch products. And then we can just copy the code from handle populate, remove these if-else statements since we don't need them for now. We're just checking to make sure our endpoint works. Change the route here to be just API/products so it matches our endpoint in the server. And then we'll console log the response. To keep this very simple, let's just come down to where you see this primary footer action prop being set. And within that, we'll change the onAction prop to our new function, fetch products, and then change the content to say fetch products. This primary footer action is basically just the button that you see on the card in the app. So that button, instead of creating the 5 products like it did before, it's now going to be hitting our new endpoint and logging the data to the console. We'll go back to the app, and once it reloads, we'll open up our inspector to the browser console and click that button we just modified. After a second, you'll see that it has logged the response. And if we expand that, you can see it has the edges array, which has all of these node objects. And there is the data we queried with our new endpoint. This was a great exercise to understand a bit more how the routes work, and specifically working with the GraphQL API. And in the upcoming videos, we'll be making a few more changes to the backend and a lot of changes to the front end. So if you haven't already, please subscribe, turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any of the upcoming videos. Once again, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in part 3.